My name is Vice Admiral Catherine Sullivan. I'm 43 years old, and I command strike groups for the United States Navy. But to my family, that has never mattered. To them, I am the failure, the one they just barred from my own grandfather's funeral. I stood in the cold November rain outside the old stone church as my mother's voice cut through the air. "Don't let her in," she said. "She's an embarrassment." My father agreed. "Let her stand in the street, like the disgrace she is." Their words were meant to break me, but I didn't flinch. I stood tall because I knew a secret they didn't, a truth hidden in my briefcase that was about to shatter their world. Have you ever been underestimated, pushed aside by the very people who should have been your greatest supporters? If you know that feeling, then you know why I did what I did next. Follow along, because this isn't just a story about revenge. It's about reclamation, and the beginning of their end starts now. The cold November rain began to seep into the shoulders of my service dress blues. I watched my breath cloud in the frigid air, a stark contrast to the warmth inside the St. Francis Episcopal Church in Potomac, Maryland. I had driven down the Clara Barton Parkway, watching the morning mist roll off the Potomac River, blanketing the last of the autumn leaves like a dreary shroud. I had allowed a foolish, fragile hope to bloom in my chest, a hope that, in the shared grief of my grandfather's passing, in the solemnity of this place, we could be a family, if only for an hour. I told myself, today, maybe it will be different. It was a lie I had told myself 1,000 times before, a mantra of self-deception that I was only now beginning to understand. As I walked up the damp stone steps, the scene unfolded exactly as it always had, just in a new, more public venue. I saw my father, Richard Sullivan, a senior partner at his K Street law firm, laughing with a U.S. senator. The moment our eyes met, the practiced political smile on his face froze, then vanished. He didn't nod. He didn't acknowledge me. He simply turned his back, a subtle, brutal dismissal that was more eloquent than any insult. Then my mother, Eleanor, emerged from the main doors, a vision of tailored grief in a black Chanel suit and a perfect strand of pearls. Her gaze swept over me, her eyes lingering on the 3 silver stars on my shoulders and the rows of ribbons on my chest as if they were a stain. "Catherine," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough for the clusters of their friends nearby to hear. "You cannot come inside dressed like that. This is a house of God, not a parade ground at the Norfolk Naval Base." My sister Amelia glided to my mother's side. She was flawless in a black Oscar de la Renta dress, her blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon. The familiar, condescending smirk played on her lips. "Mother is right," she whispered, her voice a venomous hiss meant only for me. "You look like you're here to recruit for the military, not to mourn Granddad. It's disrespectful. What will people think of this family?" That question, "what will people think?" was the Sullivan family creed, the guiding principle of their entire existence. I was still processing the sting when my father turned to the elderly usher at the door. I saw his lips move, and his words, though quiet, struck me with the force of a physical blow. "Do not let her in," he instructed the man. "She is an embarrassment to this family. Let her stand outside." The heavy oak door closed with a soft, final thud, like the sound of a coffin lid being sealed. I was alone on the portico, the cold rain now a steady, miserable drizzle. From inside, I could hear the organ begin to play the first notes of Amazing Grace, a hymn my grandfather had loved. I could imagine the pews filled with their friends, their colleagues, all the people whose opinions mattered more to them than their own daughter. I, a vice admiral in the United States Navy, a woman who had faced down threats in the Strait of Hormuz and made life-or-death decisions in the Pentagon's war rooms, was cast out. Treated like a stranger, a piece of filth to be hidden away so as not to spoil the aesthetic of their grief. A sharp physical pain clenched in my chest, making it hard to draw a full breath. They had no idea what was in the black leather briefcase I was gripping, its handle cold and hard against my knuckles. They had no idea what I had become or what I was capable of. They thought they were in control, but they were about to learn, in the most public and devastating way possible, that the rules of engagement had just changed. They were about to learn that their greatest disgrace was about to become their final reckoning. The chill of the November rain outside the church seemed to seep into my very bones, dissolving the present and pulling me back into the cold, clear waters of memory. My mind wasn't on the sea, but on the polished cherry wood dining table in my parents' Potomac home. That table was the main stage for the Sullivan family's quiet, devastating theater. Every Sunday, without fail, my mother would set it with her finest Limoges porcelain and Waterford crystal glasses, the candlelight dancing off their immaculate surfaces. The air would be filled with the aroma of the expensive meals she learned to cook in her gourmet classes. Filet mignon with a red wine reduction, or pan-seared Atlantic salmon with a dill sauce. But for me, the only flavor I ever tasted at that table was the bitter, metallic taste of loneliness. The conversation flowed around me, an impenetrable current. My father would spend the entire evening focused on Amelia, my older sister. He'd ask about her latest design projects, the influential people she was meeting in New York's fashion scene, her plans for their annual summer trip to the family's house in Martha's Vineyard. My mother would chime in, praising the cut of Amelia's new dress or the elegance of her accessories. They would discuss art auctions at Sotheby's, fundraising galas for the Kennedy Center, and the intricate politics of their country club. It was a world of polished surfaces and quiet influence, a world I orbited but could never enter. I was a ghost at their feast, a silent observer whose presence was tolerated but never truly welcomed. I remember one Sunday dinner with painful clarity. Shortly after I returned from my first overseas deployment, I was 23, full of stories I was desperate to share. I had brought gifts, a hand-woven silk scarf for my mother from a market in Dubai, and a rare single malt scotch for my father. They accepted them with polite, detached smiles. "Thank you, dear," my mother said, placing the scarf on a side table without even unfolding it. My father glanced at the label on the scotch, nodded, and then turned back to his conversation about his golf handicap. I tried to interject, to tell them about navigating through a typhoon in the Indian Ocean, about the breathtaking beauty of the port cities I'd visited. My father just nodded vaguely, his eyes fixed on his glass of Cabernet Sauvignon. My mother interrupted me with a sigh. "It all sounds so dangerous, Catherine. Perhaps you should think about a safer job on shore, something more suitable." Her words weren't a mother's concern. They were a dismissal, a clear signal that my world, my achievements, my very life, were uninteresting and inappropriate. I sat there, pushing a single asparagus spear around my plate with my fork, feeling more isolated than I ever had in the middle of the ocean. The only person who ever threw me a lifeline at that table was my grandfather, Harold. He would often join us for Sunday dinner, a quiet, steady presence in the storm of their social chatter. He was the only one who would turn to me, his eyes clear and direct, and ask the questions no one else cared about. "How's the ship, Kate? What's the morale of your crew? Have you seen the Southern Cross yet? He would tell his own stories of his time as a young officer on a destroyer during World War II, of Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Midway, his voice full of a quiet pride that my father found tedious. "That's enough, Dad," my father would often say, cutting him off. "Let's not bore everyone with old war stories." But I would listen, captivated. After dinner, while the others retired to the living room, Granddad and I would sit on the back porch overlooking the perfectly manicured lawn. He'd hand me a ginger ale and say, his voice a low rumble, "Don't you let them grind you down, kid. You were made for bigger things than fitting into their little boxes." He was my anchor, the one person who saw me for who I was, not for who they wanted me to be. The clearest memory, the one that truly sealed my fate, was the night I received my acceptance letter to the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis. I ran downstairs, my heart pounding with a joy so pure it felt like it would burst. I held the thick, official-looking envelope in my hand like a trophy. The family was in the den, watching an old black-and-white movie. I handed the letter to my father. He read it, his face a perfect blank mask, and passed it to my mother. She read it, folded it neatly, and placed it on the coffee table as if it were a utility bill. "Oh," she said, her voice light and airy. "Well, that's quite an accomplishment, dear, but your father and I were thinking you'd be a much better fit at Georgetown or UVA, like all of Amelia's friends." Amelia, who had been painting her nails, looked up and giggled. "Oh my God, Kate, what are you even going to do there? You'll probably be the only girl." That night I cried in my room, not tears of sadness, but tears of cold, hard realization. To them, my dream wasn't just different, it was a source of shame, an inconvenient deviation from the perfect family portrait they were so desperate to paint, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the core that I would have to build my own world, far away from their gilded cage. The night I realized my dream was a source of shame for my family, a profound shift occurred within me. The tears of hurt dried, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I asked myself one question in the darkness of my childhood bedroom. If their world won't have me, why not build my own? My answer to that question led me to a sweltering June morning in Annapolis, Maryland. I left the house in Potomac with a single duffel bag. My parents' farewell was a brief, sterile affair at the front door, filled with hollow pleasantries about staying safe. There were no lingering hugs, no tears, just a quiet closing of the door behind me. The moment I stepped through the gates of the United States Naval Academy, I entered another universe. The first day, I-Day, or induction day was a systematic shock designed to strip you of your identity. My hair was shorn off, my civilian clothes were taken away, replaced by a rough, unfamiliar uniform. Upperclassmen screamed in our faces, forcing us to memorize the entirety of Reef Points, the small, dense book of Naval Academy knowledge, in a matter of hours. I saw football recruits, boys built like refrigerators, break down under the relentless pressure. I, however, just clenched my fists until my knuckles were white. The emotional armor I had built over 18 years in the Sullivan household proved to be surprisingly effective. If I could survive their dinner table, I could survive this. The 4 years at the academy were a relentless crucible. I wasn't a natural athlete. I had to wake up an hour before dawn every day for extra training, pushing my body through grueling runs, rope climbs, and obstacle courses, until my lungs burned and my muscles screamed. The hands that were supposed to have learned the harp were now calloused and blistered from handling rifles and pulling oars. While my roommates received care packages filled with homemade cookies and letters from home, my mailbox was a hollow, empty void. Once a year, a birthday card from my mother would arrive. Inside would be a check and the pre-printed words "Happy Birthday," with no personal note, no handwritten sentiment. I used the money to buy textbooks on naval engineering and strategic warfare. Every night, long after the rest of Bancroft Hall had fallen silent, I would study under my small desk lamp, telling myself that every formula I mastered, every chart I memorized, was another brick in the foundation of a life they could never touch. Graduation day was bright and sunny. The Navy Marine Corps Memorial Stadium was a sea of proud families, their cheers echoing in the warm air. When my name was called, I walked across the stage, accepted my diploma, and was handed my officer's sword. I scanned the massive crowd, searching for a familiar face out of a foolish, lingering habit. Of course, they weren't there. Amelia had an incredibly important debut of her fashion collection in New York that same weekend. In that final, iconic moment, as we all threw our midshipman covers into the air in the traditional hat toss, I felt a profound, piercing loneliness. But mingled with it was a strange sense of liberation. I had done it, entirely on my own. The only approval I needed now was from the service I was about to join. I was no longer Catherine Sullivan, the disappointing daughter. I was Ensign Sullivan, United States Navy. My first tour on the destroyer, USS John Paul Jones, DDG-53, took me to places that had only been names on a map. We participated in the massive RIMPAC naval exercises off the coast of Hawaii, conducted freedom of navigation patrols in the South China Sea, and made port calls in Singapore and Japan. I spent my first Christmas in the Combat Information Center, watching radar screens instead of twinkling lights on a tree. I sent a long email home from the ship, trying to describe the raw power of the ocean, the camaraderie of the crew, the humbling beauty of a night sky, untouched by city lights. Weeks later, a reply came from my mother. It contained a single line. "Sounds busy, be sure to wear a warm coat." No questions, no encouragement. It was in that moment that I finally, truly stopped hoping. I learned to find my family in the steady hum of the ship's engines, in the easy banter with my shipmates in the mess decks, and in the unspoken trust of the men and women I led. The sea had become my home. For years, the solitude of command was my only true companion. I had shipmates, crews I respected, and who respected me. But the profound loneliness of my personal life was a quiet, constant hum beneath the roar of the ship's engines. That began to change years later, when I was the commanding officer of the cruiser USS Lake Champlain. We were on deployment in the Persian Gulf, when a tense encounter with several Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps fast boats escalated into a major international incident. It was a textbook case of following the rules of engagement. But in the political theater that followed, my career was suddenly on the line. A high-level investigation was launched, and the person assigned to be my legal counsel from the Navy's JAG Corps was a captain named Natalie Ruiz. She was petite, with a sharp, intelligent face and eyes that missed nothing. Unlike the other investigators who only saw the incident through the cold lens of reports and regulations, Natalie flew out to meet me on the ship. She spent hours in my stateroom, not just interviewing me, but listening. She spoke with my tactical action officer, my navigator, my weapons officer. She understood the immense pressure of making split-second decisions in the tight confines of the Combat Information Center, with incomplete intelligence and the threat of escalation hanging in the air. She didn't just defend my actions, she understood the why behind them. She fought for me not just with the law, but with empathy. After I was fully exonerated, I invited Natalie to dinner to thank her. We went to a casual seafood restaurant in San Diego's Little Italy, a place with outdoor seating and a good selection of local craft beers. That night, over plates of grilled fish tacos and a couple of hoppy IPAs, something in me loosened. I'm not sure why, but I started talking about my family. I didn't complain or vent. I just recounted the facts, laid them out on the table with the same detached precision I would use in a mission debrief. The story of my lonely graduation, the unanswered letters, the constant, draining feeling of being an outsider in my own home. Natalie just listened, her gaze steady and unwavering. When I finished, a heavy silence hung between us. I expected the usual platitudes, the well-meaning but empty phrases like, "But they're still your family." Instead, she took a sip of her beer, looked me straight in the eye, and said something that changed my life. "Well then," she said simply, "we just have to build our own family, Kate. The Navy is a hell of a family if you let it be." Her words weren't pitying. They were a statement of fact, an invitation. That simple act of acceptance, of seeing my reality without judgment, cracked a wall of ice around my heart that I didn't even know was there. From that day forward, Natalie became my closest friend, my chosen family. We kept in touch constantly, regardless of where in the world we were stationed. When I was promoted to Rear Admiral, a milestone my own family ignored, Natalie flew all the way from Washington, D.C. to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, to be at the ceremony. She stood in the front row, beaming with a pride that was so genuine it brought tears to my eyes. When I was deployed, she was the one who sent care packages, filled not with generic items, but with things she knew I truly loved. Bags of rich, dark roast coffee, the latest thriller from my favorite author, and a stash of good dark chocolate. She was the person I'd call at 3 a.m. over a crackling satellite phone, when the weight of command felt crushing, and she would just listen, a steady presence on the other end of the line, until I could breathe again. Her friendship was a lighthouse in a perpetual fog, a simple, unwavering warmth that reminded me I wasn't entirely alone. It was Natalie who taught me that family isn't a noun defined by blood, but a verb defined by action. It's about who shows up, who listens, who fights alongside you. The lesson became painfully clear a few years ago when my father needed emergency heart surgery. I took leave and flew home. Amelia complained endlessly about having to reschedule her meetings. My mother was preoccupied with managing the social optics, answering concerned calls from their friends at the country club. I was the one who stayed at the hospital, who sat through the long hours in the waiting room, who spoke with the surgeons who made sure he had the best possible care. When he woke up from the anesthesia, the first thing he asked, his voice weak and raspy, wasn't, "How are you, Kate?" It was, "Where's Amelia?" That night, I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot and called Natalie, the tears I had held back for days finally breaking free. She didn't try to fix it. She just said, "Let it out. And tomorrow we get up and we keep going. It's what we do." She was right. I had a family. It just didn't look the way I once thought it had to. After I was promoted to Vice Admiral and assigned to the Pentagon, I settled into a life on land for the first time in decades. I bought a small, clean-lined condo in Arlington, Virginia, with a balcony that overlooked the Air Force Memorial. A quiet rhythm began to form. Early morning runs along the Potomac, the cool air crisp against my face, a stop at a local coffee shop for a black Americano, evenings spent with a good book and the quiet hum of the city. I was beginning to feel something that had long been foreign to me, a sense of peace. My relationship with my family had settled into a state of benign neglect. I sent cards on holidays and birthdays, and they mostly left me alone. The only exception was the occasional phone call from my father, which inevitably veered into a not-so-subtle suggestion that Amelia's fashion line could use a family investment. I always politely declined. I thought that distance, that carefully maintained boundary, was my shield. I thought it was enough. That illusion of safety shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. I was reviewing a briefing document when an email notification popped up. The subject line was from the Navy Federal Credit Union. Account overdraft notification. I frowned. It had to be a mistake. A vice admiral's salary is substantial, and I've always been meticulously careful with my finances. I logged into my online banking portal, and the floor seemed to drop out from under me. It wasn't just an overdraft. My checking account was deep in the red. My savings account, the one I had built up over 25 years of service, was completely empty. My TSP, my thrift savings plan, my retirement, had been liquidated. Nearly $500,000 gone. A wave of nausea washed over me, hot and sickening. With the cold discipline of an intelligence officer piecing together a threat assessment, I began to work my way backward through years of statements. The pattern was insidious. Small withdrawals at first, then larger, recurring transfers. Extravagant purchases I'd never made. Shopping sprees at designer boutiques on Madison Avenue. Charges from high-end restaurants in Soho. The digital paper trail didn't lead to an anonymous hacker in Eastern Europe. It led directly back to the sprawling colonial house in Potomac, Maryland. The receiving accounts for the largest transfers all bore the names of my parents, Richard and Eleanor Sullivan, and Amelia's LLC. They had used a power of attorney form I had signed in my early 20s, a document I had naively given them before my first deployment so they could help with the bills while I was at sea. They had used it as a key to my entire life. Systematically, over years, they had drained everything. I found documents where my signature had been forged to secure loans against my assets, loans that financed their lavish lifestyle. The European vacations, Amelia's new Mercedes, the down payment on her Soho penthouse, it was all funded by me. By my sweat, my sacrifice, the years of my life I had given to the sea. They had been living their dream on the back of mine. 3 days later, I drove to their house. I walked in without knocking. The scene in the living room was so painfully familiar, it felt like a rerun of a show I hated. My father was reading the Wall Street Journal. My mother was watching a real estate program on HGTV. Amelia was scrolling through her Instagram, admiring photos from her latest collection launch. I stood in the middle of the room and placed a thick stack of printed bank statements on the glass coffee table. The thud was the only sound in the room. "I want an explanation," I said. My voice was flat, devoid of emotion. A military calm. The silence stretched. Then Amelia laughed. A short, dismissive chuckle. "Oh, Kate, don't be so dramatic. It's just money." My father folded his newspaper with deliberate slowness, his expression one of irritation, not guilt. "I thought you knew," he said. "Knew what?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. My mother finally looked at me, her face a mask of condescending patience. "That we were helping you, of course. You're always at sea. You have no time to manage these things. This isn't your world, Catherine." Her words were the final blow. my father added. We weren't stealing. We were protecting it, investing it. You wouldn't know what to do with that kind of money anyway. You understand naval tactics, not investment portfolios. Amelia chimed in, the final perfect twist of the knife. Exactly. And besides, that's all taxpayer money anyway. You should be proud you could help your sister contribute something beautiful to the world. The audacity, the absolute, unshakable conviction that they were in the right snuffed out the last ember of affection I might have had for them. I looked at the three of them, these strangers who shared my blood, and I saw nothing but avarice and a bottomless well of entitlement. In that moment, something inside me didn't just break, it calcified. It turned into something cold, hard, and unbreakable. I gave a slow, deliberate nod. Thank you, I said softly, my voice as steady as a ship's compass. Thank you for making everything so clear. They smiled, the smug, self-satisfied smiles of victors, believing they had won again. They had no idea they had just lost the only war that would ever truly matter. My mother's words, the family needed it more, echoed in the pristine silence of their living room. They didn't just steal from me, they believed it was their right. They had rationalized their theft into an act of familial duty. My father's follow-up, his voice dripping with condescension, was even worse. Catherine, you understand naval tactics, but you don't understand the real world, the world of money. We were protecting you from your own naivete. Amelia delivered the final, most insulting blow. Exactly, she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. Besides, it's all just taxpayer money anyway. Consider it your way of contributing to society through my art. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of it, the twisting of my service into a justification for their greed, extinguished the last dying ember of family feeling within me. I looked at the three of them, these well-dressed, educated, and utterly hollow people who had raised me, and I saw nothing but strangers. In that moment, something inside of me that had been slowly dying for years finally gave its last breath. But from its ashes, something else, something harder, colder, and far more powerful, was born. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply held their gazes one by one. I looked into my father's eyes, the eyes of a man who had once lectured me on the importance of integrity. I looked into my mother's eyes, the eyes of a woman who chaired charities for the less fortunate. I saw nothing there, no remorse, no conflict, just an abyss of self-interest. I gave a slow, deliberate nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of a terrible, undeniable truth. Thank you, I said, my voice quiet and steady, almost unnervingly so. Thank you for making everything so perfectly clear. A flicker of a triumphant smile crossed their faces. They thought they had won. They thought I would retreat and swallow this humiliation, just as I had swallowed all the others. They had no idea. They had just made the last and greatest mistake of their lives. I turned, my back straight, my movements precise, and walked out of that house without a backward glance. The door closing behind me was the sound of a final severance. I drove back to my Arlington condo in a state of hyper-aware calm. The hot, messy anger had cooled and crystallized into a solid block of ice in my chest, sharp, clear, and unyielding. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, in the leather armchair by my window, and watched the distant, glittering lights of the Washington, D.C. monuments. I saw my reflection in the glass, a woman in the uniform of a vice admiral, a leader of men and women, but inside I still felt the ghost of that small, unheard child. I had dedicated my entire adult life to serving a nation, built on a foundation of ideals, honor, courage, commitment. My oath was to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And the people who should have been my staunchest allies, my home port in any storm, had instead become the enemy within. They would not win. They would not define me by their greed, nor would they use my life's work as their personal expense account. Tonight I recognized my true enemy, and I would face them. At 200 hours, I picked up my phone. The decisive moment. I dialed Natalie Ruiz. She answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep but instantly alert. "Kate, what's wrong?" I took a deep breath, the cool night air filling my lungs, steadying me. "I need your help," I said, my voice unwavering, stripped of all doubt. "Not as a friend, I need Captain Ruiz, the lawyer." There was a brief pause on the other end, the sound of her mind instantly shifting from sleep to strategy. Then her voice came back, crisp and all business. "I understand. My office. 00700. Bring everything." I ended the call. The battle had been declared. And this time I would not fight it alone. I would fight it with the law, with the truth, and with the full unyielding weight of a 25-year career built on honor. Before we move on to the plan we forged in that office, I need to stop and ask you something. Have you ever been pushed to a point where you knew, with absolute certainty, that if you didn't stand up for yourself, no one else would? That moment when silence is no longer an option, and fighting back becomes the only way to reclaim your own soul. If you know that feeling, I want you to leave a comment below and just say, "I know," because you are not alone. And make sure you follow along, because the war room is now open, and the strategy we are about to unleash is something they never ever saw coming. The meeting at 0700 was not one of grief and consolation. It was a council of war. Natalie Ruiz's conference room in downtown D.C., a sleek space of glass and steel with a sweeping view of the city, became our command center. The large whiteboard, usually reserved for complex corporate litigation strategies, was quickly covered in a web of flowcharts, timelines, and names connected by damning red lines drawn with a Sharpie. This was our battlefield map, an intricate diagram of my family's betrayal. We weren't alone. Natalie, ever the strategist, had brought in Charles Yates, a forensic accountant and a retired naval intelligence officer. He was a quiet, meticulous man in his late 50s with eyes that seemed to see patterns in chaos, the same way he once deciphered enemy communications. As I laid out the thick stacks of bank statements, the old power of attorney documents I had foolishly signed, and years of tax records, he didn't show a flicker of surprise or pity. He simply put on his reading glasses, took a sip of his black coffee, and began to work. For hours, the only sounds in the room were the rustle of paper, the quiet clicking of his 10-key calculator, and the low hum of the city below. It was a familiar kind of intensity, reminiscent of long nights in the Combat Information Center, waiting for a threat to materialize. Finally, Charles leaned back, removing his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "They were sloppy, Admiral," he said, his voice a calm, steady baritone that cut through the tension. "Incredibly sloppy. They operated under the assumption of absolute impunity, believing you would never check. They thought you were too busy protecting the world to have the time or energy to protect yourself. That, right there, was their critical tactical error." His words were a cold, professional confirmation of the betrayal, but they also acted as a balm to a part of me that had started to question my own sanity. I wasn't crazy. This was real, meticulously documented, and provably criminally real. The weeks that followed were a deep, methodical dive into the anatomy of their deceit. We worked late into the nights, fueled by stale coffee and a shared, silent sense of purpose. Charles, with his intelligence background, unearthed layers of fraud that were even more depraved than I had imagined. My father had used my name and spotless credit record to co-sign a high-risk business loan for a commercial real estate venture that had subsequently failed, leaving a significant, ugly mark on my financial history without my knowledge. My mother, I discovered, had used a supplementary credit card in my name to fund lavish vacations in Tuscany and bi-weekly spa days at the Ritz-Carlton. And Amelia had treated my savings as her personal seed fund. She had paid her Soho penthouse rent, hired a high-priced publicist, and thrown extravagant, champagne-fueled parties to promote her brand, all while I was on the other side of the world, living out of a duffel bag. Every receipt from a Parisian boutique, every wire transfer, every forged signature was another piece of evidence of their absolute, profound contempt for me and the life I had built. After one particularly long night sifting through wire transfer records, Natalie looked at the mountain of evidence we had compiled, her expression grim. "Kate," she said, her voice firm, all friendship put aside for legal clarity. "We have more than enough to press criminal charges, wire fraud, embezzlement, identity theft. They could face serious prison time." I was silent for a long time, staring out at the city lights. The thought of them in prison, of seeing their carefully constructed world crumble into public scandal and orange jumpsuits, didn't bring me the satisfaction I thought it would. It felt like their kind of justice, loud, messy, and public. Not mine. I wanted something else, something more powerful. I wanted the truth to be deployed with the precision of a guided missile, striking not their freedom, but their pride, right in the heart of the world they valued most. The breakthrough, the weapon I was looking for, came on a quiet Saturday afternoon. My grandfather's funeral was just days away, and I was going through some of his old boxes he'd left with me, looking for a photograph to give the eulogist. Tucked away at the very bottom of a heavy oak sea chest, one carved with the silhouette of a Fletcher-class destroyer, I found it. Beneath his neatly folded dress blues and a small case of tarnished Tawabupiru medals was a thick, yellowed envelope. My heart hammered against my ribs as I recognized his elegant, deliberate handwriting on the front. With hands that suddenly felt unsteady, I carefully slid my finger under the seal. Inside was his original, notarized last will and testament, dated just 5 years prior. He had left his entire estate, the sprawling Potomac house that my parents were living in, his sizable investment portfolio, his rare book collection, to me. A handwritten letter was attached with a simple paperclip. For my granddaughter Catherine, it read, the only one in this family who truly understands the meaning of the words honor and service. Use this to build a good life, the one you deserve. Don't let anyone take that from you. I sank to the floor, the documents trembling in my hands, as the first real tears since this ordeal began streamed down my face. They weren't tears of pain, but of overwhelming gratitude and validation. He knew. Somehow he had known all along. And he had provided me with the ultimate weapon. The very foundation of their social standing, the house they entertained in, was legally mine. The investments that fueled their lifestyle were mine. I called Natalie immediately, my voice thick with emotion. I read her the contents of the will. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Then I could almost hear the smile in her voice as she spoke, her tone now filled with a thrill of anticipation. "Kate," she said, "that's not a smoking gun. That's a nuclear warhead, and we have the perfect time and place to detonate it." My grandfather's funeral. The stage was set. And so we return to the cold, damp portico of St. Francis Episcopal, where I stood alone in the rain. My family was inside, cocooned in their performance of grief. They believed they had won, that they had successfully exiled their inconvenient problem. But the overture was just beginning. Just as the organ inside swelled, a new sound cut through the quiet drizzle. A sound I knew better than my own heartbeat. It was the sound of precise, synchronized footsteps, the sharp, rhythmic cadence of military boots striking pavement in perfect unison. From down the street, a formation of sailors from the U.S. Navy, ceremonial guard emerged from the mist, their white gloves stark against the dark wood of their M1 Garand rifles, held with flawless discipline. They didn't march toward the church entrance, they marched toward me. They formed two perfect ranks on either side of the walkway, creating a corridor of honor that led directly to where I stood. The hushed conversations among the mourners outside ceased. Heads turned. A ripple of confusion and awe spread through the crowd of Washington's elite. The senators, the lobbyists, the partners from my father's law firm. They knew this was not part of the civilian program. On the church steps, I saw my father's face tighten, my mother's hand fly to her pearl necklace, in a gesture of nervous shock. Amelia's smirk finally faltered, replaced by a look of sheer, undisguised bewilderment. They knew this was a display of power, but they couldn't comprehend its source or its target. They only knew that their carefully orchestrated event had just been commandeered by a force they could not control. Then a black sedan, with a small 4-star flag on its fender, pulled silently to the curb behind the honor guard. The door was opened by a driver, and a man in the immaculate blue uniform of a full admiral stepped out. It was the Chief of Naval Operations, the CNO himself, the highest-ranking officer in the entire United States Navy. He was a living legend, a man whose command decisions shaped global events, a man my father would have given a fortune to have at his dinner table. He ignored the stunned crowd, his gaze fixed, and walked with quiet authority through the corridor of sailors directly toward me. The world seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the gentle patter of the rain on the stone. My family on the steps looked like statues carved from ice, their faces a mask of dawning horror. They were beginning to understand. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a message. The CNO stopped exactly 3 paces from me. He removed his officer's cover, holding it crisply against his chest. Then, with the deepest respect, he executed a perfect formal salute. "Vice Admiral Sullivan, ma'am," he said, his voice calm but carrying with an authority that resonated across the entire churchyard. "I and the United States Navy are here today to honor the life of a great sailor, Petty Officer Harold Sullivan, and to recognize the distinguished service and courage with which you continue to serve this nation." I returned the salute, my own movements sharp and steady, my eyes locked on his. In that single silent gesture, the world my family had built around their own importance shattered into a million pieces. The public recognition, the ultimate validation from the highest echelon of the institution I had dedicated my life to, vaporized every dismissive word they had ever uttered. They wanted me to be their shame, but in that moment, in front of their entire world, I was the embodiment of honor. But the performance was not over. As the CNO stepped back, my lawyer, Natalie Ruiz, emerged from the crowd. She was dressed in a professional, impeccably tailored black suit, carrying a leather portfolio. She walked to the center of the steps, positioning herself in front of my stunned family and addressing the silent, watching crowd. By the final request of the deceased, Mr. Harold Sullivan, she announced, her voice clear and unwavering, I have been asked to read a legally binding codicil from his last will and testament. She opened the portfolio. The silence was now absolute. And then she read. Each word detonated in the quiet air like a depth charge. The Potomac House, the stocks and bonds, the investment properties, all of it bequeathed not to his son, but to my beloved granddaughter, Vice Admiral Catherine Sullivan, the sole heir who has carried forward the family's legacy of service and honor. A collective audible gasp went through the crowd. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see them. My mother was swaying, clutching my father's arm to keep from falling. My father's face was ashen, the color of wet cement. And Amelia, my perfect golden sister, her beautiful face was twisted into an ugly mask of disbelief and pure, unadulterated everything they had, everything they were, the house that gave them their social standing, the money that funded their lifestyle, the very foundation of their smug superiority. All of it had just been stripped away from them, publicly, irrevocably, and with devastating precision. They could do nothing. They could say nothing. Their world had ended, not with a bang, but with the calm, clear reading of a dead man's final, honest words. After Natalie's voice cut through the stunned silence of the churchyard, the world seemed to hold its breath for a long moment. The Chief of Naval Operations, his duty done, gave me one final, respectful nod before he and the ceremonial guard departed as precisely and quietly as they had arrived. Their exit created a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed a thick, unbearable awkwardness. The carefully constructed social theater of my family had been publicly dismantled. I watched as their world, their audience, began to evaporate. Their friends, the senators, the lawyers, the influential figures from the D.C. Circuit started to disperse with a sudden, urgent haste. They offered clipped, mumbled condolences to no one in particular, their eyes darting anywhere but towards me or my now isolated family. I stood my ground, observing the fallout. My father, a man who commanded boardrooms and swayed juries, looked utterly lost, his face a canvas of pure, dawning horror. It wasn't anger in his eyes. It was the look of a man whose entire map of the world had just been declared a fiction. My mother, Eleanor, was whispering frantically to Amelia, whose beautiful face was now a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred, her blue eyes fixed on me like daggers. She looked like a queen whose castle had just crumbled into dust around her. I let them stand there for a moment, marinating in the public humiliation they had so feared. Then, without another word, I turned, walked calmly down the stone steps, and headed toward my car, leaving them alone with the wreckage of their own making. The days that followed were a carefully orchestrated storm of communication, a last-ditch effort to reclaim control. My phone buzzed incessantly. First came the concerned calls from distant aunts and uncles, their voices dripping with a false, saccharine sympathy as they probed for gossip. "Kate, dear, I heard there was some misunderstanding at the funeral. Is everything all right?" I let them all go to voicemail. Then came the vitriol from Amelia, a barrage of text messages that vibrated with her rage. "You've destroyed this family. You are a selfish, unnatural monster. All you've ever cared about is yourself and your stupid career." I read them, a strange sense of detachment washing over me, and then deleted the entire thread. Finally, the more formal assault began. Emails from my father's attorney, a man I'd known since I was a child, now formally requesting a constructive discussion to resolve this sensitive matter as a family. The irony was staggering. I forwarded every single message, every email, every saved voicemail to Natalie. She became my firewall, my impenetrable defense. In response, she sent a single, concise legal letter to their lawyer. It was a masterpiece of cold, professional efficiency, stating that all future communication must be directed through her office. It also officially informed them of our intent to begin the legal process of executing Harold Sullivan's will, and, pointedly, to initiate a full forensic audit of my finances. During the years, the power of attorney was active. The boundary had been drawn not in sand, but in concrete and steel. There was only one call that managed to slip through the barricade. It came a few days later, from an unknown number. It was my mother. Her voice, usually so clipped and brimming with social superiority, was thin and laced with a poorly concealed panic. "Catherine," she began, "what do you think you are doing? You are destroying your father's reputation. You're destroying this family. Everyone at the Chevy Chase Club is talking." I listened in silence, recognizing the familiar refrain. "What will people think?" She continued, her voice cracking now, taking on a tone that bordered on a plea. "We can fix this. Just tell your lawyer to stand down. We can talk. Your father and I, we can give you some of it back." Some of it. The phrase hung in the air, a perfect summary of their entire worldview. I took a deep, steadying breath. "Mrs. Eleanor," I said, the formal address feeling both alien and absolutely correct on my tongue. For the first time, I wasn't speaking to her as a daughter seeking approval, but as an equal. This was never just about the money. It was about respect. And that is the one thing you and your family can never give back to me, because you never had it to begin with. Please do not call me again. I ended the call before she could form a reply, the click of the phone a final, decisive sound. The severance was complete. It was painful, yes, but it was also necessary. I had won. The legal proceedings were, as Natalie predicted, swift and straightforward. The house was mine. The money was being recovered. I had taken back everything they had stolen. But as I sat in my quiet Arlington condo, looking out at the city lights, the thrill of victory I had anticipated never came. Instead, there was a strange, hollow emptiness. It was the silence after a long, brutal battle, when the adrenaline fades and all that's left is exhaustion and the dull throbbing ache of your wounds. Natalie came over that evening, bringing a bottle of good Pinot Noir and 2 glasses. We sat in comfortable silence for a while before she asked gently, "Are you okay?" I shook my head, the gesture feeling heavy. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice quiet. "I feel like I just amputated a part of myself. It was gangrenous, I know, but it still hurts." She reached over and placed her hand on mine, her touch warm and steady. "It's supposed to hurt," she said softly. "But this is the pain of healing, Kate, not the pain of the infection spreading. You're free now." Free. The word echoed in the quiet room, full of a weight and a terrifying possibility I was only just beginning to understand. The legal process unfolded just as Natalie had predicted, swiftly and decisively. Faced with an avalanche of irrefutable evidence, my family's lawyers advised them against a fight they could not win. The transfer of the Potomac house into my name, the reimbursement of the stolen funds, plus interest. It was all settled out of court, a quiet, anticlimactic end to a lifetime of turmoil. I stood as the victor, the rightful heir, the one who had reclaimed everything. Yet the thought of moving into that house, of walking those halls filled with the ghosts of 1,000 slights, felt like a punishment, not a prize. The money, too, felt foreign in my account, tainted by the betrayal it represented. It wasn't mine to spend on a life of luxury I had never wanted. Holding my grandfather's final letter, his words about building a good life echoed in my mind. What did that mean? For so long, my life had been defined by a reaction to them, by proving them wrong, by surviving their neglect, by fighting their injustice. Now, with the war over, I felt a vast, quiet emptiness. Who was I without them as an adversary? I realized then that a good life, a life of honor, wasn't about what you owned or what you won. It was about what you built. My legacy couldn't be a story of revenge. It had to be a story of restoration. I made a decision. I sold the house in Potomac. I took every dollar recovered from their accounts, combined it with the full inheritance from my grandfather, and established a charitable foundation in his name, the Harold Sullivan Fund. Its mission was simple: to serve those who had served. The fund's first project was ambitious. We found an old, disused warehouse in a forgotten corner near Naval Station Norfolk, the largest naval base in the world. For months, I poured my energy into its transformation. This wouldn't be a sterile, soulless shelter. I wanted to build a place of dignity. We installed polished hardwood floors, comfortable leather armchairs, and shelves filled with books. We built a modern, gleaming kitchen and pristine bathrooms with hot showers. We named it the Safe Harbor. It was a daytime drop-in center for veterans, particularly former sailors, who were experiencing homelessness or just struggling to find their footing back on land. Every morning at 0600, our doors would open. We offered a hot breakfast, fresh coffee, clean laundry facilities, internet access for job searches, and on-site counselors to help with VA benefits and mental health support. I wanted to create a place where they could come in, take a deep breath, and be treated not as a problem to be solved, but as the heroes they were. Every Saturday and Sunday, I would make the drive down from D.C. to Norfolk. At the Safe Harbor, I would take off the uniform of a vice admiral and put on a simple apron. There, I wasn't Admiral Sullivan. I was just Kate, the woman who poured the coffee, who flipped the pancakes until they were golden brown, who knew just how they liked their eggs. I was the one who would sit down at a table and just listen. I heard stories that would break your heart, stories of brutal firefights in Fallujah, of the crushing, silent loneliness of life on a submarine, and most painfully, stories of families that had fractured under the strain of war and PTSD. They were stories of men and women who had given everything for their country, only to come home and find they no longer had a place to belong. In their company, among these quiet, resilient souls, who understood the language of unspoken scars, I found the deepest connection of my life. This was my crew. This was my ship. One morning, an old chief petty officer, a Vietnam vet with eyes that had seen too much, watched me as I refilled his coffee cup. He nodded slowly and said, "You know, Admiral, you show up. Every weekend, you're here. That means something." He was right. It meant everything. It was in these small acts of service, the simple offering of a hot meal, a warm smile, a listening ear, that the deep wounds inside me began to heal. I had found my true family, a family forged not by blood, but by shared experience and mutual respect. A year to the day after the funeral, a letter arrived, addressed simply to Kate at the Safe Harbor. there was no return address. Inside, on a single sheet of his law firm's expensive stationery, was a message in my father's shaky, unfamiliar handwriting. It was just one sentence. "I hope you find the peace you deserve." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an admission of guilt or a plea for forgiveness. But it was an acknowledgement, a white flag from a man who had never admitted defeat in his life. For me, it was enough. It didn't erase the past, but it allowed me to close the door on it without slamming it shut. Some wounds never fully disappear. They become a part of who you are. I folded the letter and placed it inside my grandfather's old oak box, alongside his medals and his final words to me. That evening, I stayed late at the center, long after the last veteran had left and the volunteers had gone home. I sat in one of the comfortable armchairs, the room filled with the lingering, comforting smell of coffee and bacon. I looked around at the space we had built, a place of warmth, of dignity, of community. I hadn't let their bitterness define my future. I had taken the inheritance of their betrayal and transformed it into a legacy of kindness. They had tried to write my story for me, to cast me as the failure, the disgrace. But I had taken back the pen. I had written my own ending, and finally, after a long and turbulent voyage, I was home. I had built my own safe harbor. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. Before we say goodbye, I have one last question for you. Where are you listening to this from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night when stories like this one keep you company? Wherever you are, I hope you know you're not alone. If my journey has resonated with you, I hope you'll consider subscribing. It's more than just a channel. It's a community for those of us who believe in second chances and in building our own safe harbors. Take care, and I'll see you in the next story.